next up is Dennis Slattery. Now, also talking about myth as story, story as myth. Dennis Slattery has been around the Dallas Institute for such a long time, been one of our heroes here, one of our teachers in the Summer Institute for Teachers. I had some classes with Dennis, graduate classes at the University of Dallas, Joanne, from Hillman, from Robert, from Dr. Louise Cowan. So you see, we all go way back. We have all this ground, which is just delightful to see what's growing up from this deep, rich humus of telling stories, because that's what we did. Now, Dr. Slattery has just been awarded Professor Emeritus at Pacifica. Is that right? Yeah. Which means he will be going back and teaching, which is just great for those of you going to Pacifica, because he's been teaching there for how many years? 30? 23 years. And I just think it's an extraordinary thing that so many people have received the richness of his imagination. And Saffron just alluded to that. She said her old teacher. You're not that old. No. Okay. Dennis is co-author, co-author, editor of 25 volumes, over 200 articles. He is a prolific writer. We get his his writings. I just can't believe how he can produce the way he does. He needs to retire just to pay attention to his writing. And he's working now on a book on the Odyssey. He has just revised Grace in the Desert, and it's called A Pilgrimage Beyond Belief. Extraordinary human being, deep-souled teacher and writer, Dr. Dennis Slattery.
I've not seen you all from this vantage point. I just want to take 10 seconds to just look at you. Wow. I want to thank Gustavo Beck for opening up Oedipus Revisited and giving us insights, additional insights, into that magnificent essay. Thank you. And Pat, thank you for reminding us that if this work of James cannot be renegotiated and recalibrated, then it's dead. That's huge to hear. So thank you. Oh, they started the clock. See, I was going to stall and then maybe get 30 minutes. All right, so now I've got to really hustle.
We've all tried that.
Oh, have you? I'm a little slow on the uptake with the Hermes move. Yeah. So this is entitled Oedipus Revised, James Hillman Revisited. Mimesis, Memory, and the Shaping of a Personal Myth in Oedipus Revisited. So just to give you a quick umbrella sentence, I'm interested in how deep reading is a form of archetypal activism. That's what I'm up to. And I start with an epigram from Jung. This is worth taking down, if you'd like. It's short. One sees what can, let me get it correct, erase that. One sees what one can best see oneself. One sees what one can best see oneself. Volume 6, paragraph 10, if you're interested in the reference. Myth and story is a categorized way into pairing two basic human concerns. James reminds us in Healing Fiction. I want to come in through the back door of Healing Fiction to Mythic Figures. He reminds us in Healing Fiction of an important coupling of poetics with psychology. Here's what he says. Freud's one plot is named after a myth, Oedipus. Freud's discovery of the Oedipus tragedy located psychology at the very beginning of poetics, with Aristotle's use of mythos. When we open that book, James continues, to read in English about plot, we find that wherever plot appears, the original Greek word is mythos. Plots are myths. The basic answers to why in a story are to be discovered in myths. Page 11. As I return to Mythic Figures to reflect on a broad range of observations James makes about fictions and figures, I want to focus on this essay, Oedipus Revisited, in order to develop what I think resides behind the scenes. James' thinking about the nature of figures and fictions implicates in profound ways Aristotle's thinking about the nature of mimesis. James' own methodology, and I'm tempted to call it a mythodology if you change one letter, and I want to claim that neologism. I never read it anywhere, and if you've come across it, they plagiarized me. So James's own methodology might be called mythomimetic. I'm working with the assumption at the outset that Oedipus Revisited is as concerned with an archetypal way of reading as it is a series of openings into the complex poetics of Sophocles and into the intricate psyche of Oedipus. As Oedipus reveals to us the complexity of a personal myth, James outlines in his reading a corresponding myth of complexity by means of his rich reading by analogy. Matter and methodology remain joined through his explication so that we are asked to read the essay on two levels at once. The realm of the Oedipus geography and events that lead the narrative, as well as the archetypal energy that James exposes to reveal the field that is activated and exposed by the plot's insistent presence, as well as by the propulsion of its literal details. Every classic poem, I believe, even every work of art, contains an internal energy system that gives it its life and its vitality. Interpretation itself involves, among other elements, a bending or a warping of the story's matter by these energies, so some composite of meaning begins to appear for the reader. Otherwise, the work makes no sense. Plot is the matter, and action is the energy that propels the matter of the plot forward. James' own insights wed these two arenas or fields or grounds with such intensity that he is able to see in that marriage what many of us miss or only dimly discern. The plot thickens, he writes, page 168. As in Sophocles' play performed initially in Athens sometime after 430 BCE, Bernard Knox informs us in his introduction to the three Theban plays, James observes early on in his essay that Mount Cithaeron harbors many moments of violence long before Oedipus ever meets his father in that constricted passageway. And it all hangs on the constriction. More of that in a moment. But here we note James connecting psychoanalysis as a corresponding story to that of Oedipus. Like Sophocles' play, like Freudian analysis, we begin to detect a repressed or forgotten clue. Oedipus Rex is a murder mystery. Again, the Oedipal imagination catches us in its atmosphere. Our very way of pursuing the topic seeks to bring to light the buried real story. And the clues, James writes, are so evident. Now, I want to suggest here that if the plot of a story is the literal action, then the real story, that's his language, comprises the arena of the archetypal action. And then behind it is an energic field that gives it its persuasive power. And I use the adjective energic, E-N-E-R-G-I-C. I'm borrowing that from Jung. Now, that way, I have in italics, he speaks of above is what I'm calling one's personal myth. The attitude or angle or way of seeing that allows the reality of our events, of our individual life events, to take on a certain tincture or hue drawn from a palette of colors that shades how and what we are aware of and what we let slip by. An aesthetics of blindness and insight. We find ourselves in Sophocles' plays analogically following and interpreting Oedipus as we become him less through the plot than through the action that energizes perception itself. But more than that, we witness James alternately falling into and extricating himself from the myth of Oedipus. Imaginal process and interpretive product congeal where three roads meet. The text read, the text recollected and written about. That's the trivium. That James falls under the sway of the play itself as a character. The play itself is a character. Moreover, the Sphinx that Oedipus meets at the gates of Thebes is also the play's riddle that James confronts. It insists on being responded to. But not just with Oedipal reasoning, intent on solving a mathematical equation. 1 leg, 2 legs, 3 legs, but more soulfully with a mimetic imagining. Mimesis is the place of analogical making and the arena of soul making in a process that critiques and replaces the traditional roles and methodologies of psychoanalysis. And I'll return to that in just a minute. In a footnote to the Sphinx's riddle, James furthers Jung's insight that the riddle of the Sphinx was herself the terrible mother imago, this is James's language, which Oedipus would not take as a warning. Page 169. Oedipus fell victim to his tragic fate, James writes, because he thought he had answered the question. It was the Sphinx itself that he ought to have answered and not its facade. That's in footnote 20, same page. Here, I sense, is a moment of mimesis. For there exists the surface story of the Sphinx's fascia, F-A-S-C-I-A, which hides and riddles the mythic narrative below the surface that the facade offers a simulacrum or an analogy of. What James refers to as the Sphinx itself may be the archetypal energy field that gives shape to the myth, but is itself formless. Poetic form is the expression of the Sphinx itself. In that same spirit, James intends to use Sophocles' play as a corridor into revisioning psychology's own history. employing as one of his several launch pads a paragraph on the nature of fantasy from Jung's psychological types. I'm just going to read you part of Jung's quote. But I think this quote on fantasy from Jung served as one of the centerpieces for Jung, for James Hillman in all of his writings. And here's what Jung says. This autonomous activity of the psyche, which can be explained neither as a reflex to sensory stimuli, nor as the executive organ of eternal ideas, is like every vital process, a continually creative act. And then I'm going to drop down to the end of that quote. It is preeminently the creative activity from which the answers to all answerable questions come. This is Jung. Where, like all psychological opposites, the inner and outer worlds are joining together in a living union. Fantasy it was, and ever is, which fashions the bridge between the irreconcilable claims of subject and object, introversion and extroversion. And the reference is collected work 6, paragraph 78. It's really worth meditating on that paragraph. Now, using this paragraph as a guide, James sets as his task a rewriting of traditional ideas underpinning psychoanalysis. His purpose is to be worked through in this essay is no less grand and profound as is Oedipus's search for the killer of his father. After he has convinced himself that his leaving Corinth and his supposed parents, Polybus and Merope, has been a success. Never mind the man he grappled with on the narrowing road on the other side of Mount Cytheron. That drops out of his consciousness. James's research for the origins of psychology and mythology through the plot of Sophocles' play is the location for retrieving a mythic, or better said, mythopoetic consciousness that will allow him to see more, not less, of the Oedipus escaping his destiny based on a false assumption, the confrontation with his father, solving and being seduced by the Sphinx, whose riddle concentrates on how many feet one stands on in 3 stages of one's life, the initial denial of his own woundedness, and the fatedness of his swollen feet, guiding him precisely to the story that betrays his sense of success at having vanquished Apollo's oracle, while at the same time revealing the destiny, the contours of his own destiny. As Bernard Knox points out in his discussion of Oedipus, the Greek oidi, O-I-D-I, meaning to swell, is very close to oida, O-I-D-A, to know. We are asked to imagine what a swollen form of knowing might look like. Sophocles' brilliance is just off the chart. By contrast, James' journey is taken in a spirit and an attitude of openness and curiosity, as well as a belief that the Oedipus story will allow the following possibility, which he assumes correctly. James's language. Our first aim is to unearth other relevances for depth psychology in the Oedipus story, for that is where the theater of Oedipus continues to be performed. Not unlike, if I may draw an analogy of my own, here at the Dallas Institute for now 6 years, this theater of James Hillman continues to be performed, always with provocative and often dramatic unearthings. See, I think we're doing with Hillman's work what Hillman is doing with psychoanalysis through the aperture of Oedipus Rex. Now we are far enough into the play and into Oedipus Revisited to suggest that James' methodology is a form of mimetic mythology, a way into Oedipus and into reformatting psychology's predominant myth. It may be as well a furthering of Aristotle's notion of mimesis that the Greek philosopher gives short space to in his Poetics. Nonetheless, he has provided explorations of this term up to the present. Books are still coming out on the nature of mimesis. It's uncanny. And so I'm going to collapse what I have here on mimesis as a mode of seeing correspondences. You know, just taking a couple of these ideas about mimesis. I mean, there's small libraries written on it, on that term. Depth psychology may be referred to as a mimetic mythology, and Oedipus himself, a relentless pursuer I'm trying to hurry and slow it down, Slattery. A relentless pursuer of his history with the same stamina and brilliance as James' own pursuit of the depth psychological nature of poetics, and specifically Sophocles' genius in this play, and then in Oedipus at Colonus, which I was so happy to hear. I can't even remember who it was, but it was brilliant to bring Colonus into the discussion. So this idea of mimesis has to do with a representation, and two books that I want to suggest to you, and I'm going to pull from one of them. Both are by Stephen Halliwell, Halliwell. One is entitled Aristotle's Poetics, a brilliant study. And the other is The Aesthetics of Mimesis. In the second one, Halliwell relates the story that he cites from Herodotus of a man carrying a small wooden corpse around a banquet table. The verb is mimisthai, which means reproduction or copying of appearance. And then he goes on to speak about Aristotle breaking through Plato's notion of mimesis, which he felt was way too narrow and not imaginal enough. And so I discussed that a little bit in the next page, but I'm going to push on beyond it. And what I'm going to read here in this paragraph is from Halliwell is responding to a section in Aristotle's Poetics. What he finds extraordinary in this is that it liberates poetry and the visual arts from the narrowness of Plato's idea that poetry is little more than a literalistic model of a transcription of material reality. And then he argues, Aristotle argues against that. Of course, the term mimesis, and I apologize for talk about being on the constricted road on the side of Mount Cithaeron. I'm in it. Of course, the term mimesis was familiar to James, who uses it throughout his writings. It is present in the Oedipus essay in a way that leads me to refer to James' methodology as the originating and original work of a mythic, mimetic poet of soul. That's hugely James' contribution. Not the only one, but hugely. I say this because I believe that in the essay he formulates a poetic therapeutics and finds in the Oedipus of Sophocles, with Oedipus's attempt to escape the oracle's prophecy uttered by the inebriated man in the tavern, his own woundedness, his seeking the cure of the city, as examples of a persuasive field of correspondences in which to advance a psychology that has its analogy in the character of Oedipus after his self-blinding, which is where the play ends. As James lays out his trajectory, continuing the line of Freud and Jung and drawing further parallels between myth and psychoanalysis, I can't help but wonder if Oedipus's own wounded search and developing recognition that he was working along correct lines, but guided by wrong assumptions. Does that not have its analogy in making psychoanalysis aware that it too is moving along reasonable lines of inquiry with false assumptions guiding the fantasy? Assumptions themselves, whether individual or collective, carry parts of our myth that have gone below the floorboards of consciousness. What we assume is part of our personal myth. A major thrust of tragedy's action is the growing awareness, often through violence or a form of dismembering, that what has been unconscious but no less active surfaces to be seen again or for the first time. If so, then psychoanalysis suffers the Oedipal wound that James wishes to renegotiate and realign. All early maladies track back to the absolute power of the parents, but that power is not recognized, nor are the parents, as necessarily myth. Oedipus, like the discipline that James critiques, takes events as historical facts, but to reduce its meaning to one level is to demythologize one's recollections. He then draws direct associations between historical events and mythic realities in the following citation. Their importance rises not from historical events, but by mythical happenings, that, as Sallustius said, never happen, but always are, as fictions. I suggest that mimesis is, in one of its formats, re-enters here in close association with both metaphor and memory in what Jean-Michel Ogorlian calls mimetic reciprocity in his provocative study called the mimetic brain. My sense is that history embeds myth in its temporality, as myth enjoys a position as the inner sleeve of history, invisible but present, giving shape and order and a certain resilience to it, as an invisible sleeve of a suit or a jacket offers the shape of the garment a particular fit. It is fitting then, and fits the history of an imaginal level of understanding. Myth itself is mimetic by design, memorial by necessity, and metaphorical by inclination. You just heard the punchline of the essay. I'm going to read it a second time because I like the sentence and it might mean something. Myth is mimetic by design, memorial by necessity, and metaphorical by inclination. What Oedipus learns, my time's up, but I do have just a couple of more minutes, right? And I'll be real careful here because I want to come to the end of the essay. James's own language in his exploration, words he is fully conscious of, begins to steal into his descriptions and caveats. For example, when he reminds us that, quote, myth hides from recognition and lies disguised in literal and secular case histories, he asserts, we must see this clearly. In italics, this is James. And here again, I use Oedipal heroic language, James, page 162. Only through a return to the bedrock of fantasies, the myths, can psychology as it is now conceived awaken to itself. And I'll finish right here by saying to you, and then a reverse spiral. Here's how the essay ends. Where we listen to a once blind Oedipus, James, who now, with hindsight, gains insight. Here's what he says. I have since recognized that the presentation of this paper is a presentation of self, of Oedipal self, of a blind man in a sick city, struggling with the Apollonic curse of his world, psychoanalysis. And he goes on, I did not realize that I was in the play. that the drama was so powerful. And he's not being disingenuous. He's come to a real insight about what the critique was saying about the Oedipal James. I did not recognize that it was I who could not hear to the heart of my own discourse. Even my asking and answering, why did I come? Why do I speak? Is Oedipal. Page 197. Last paragraph. The mimetic spiral closes with this recognition. James' own anagnoresis, which is that turning about in Greek tragedy and looking back and recognizing the patterns that one could not see moving forward. And here are the three roads. The first is a critique of psychoanalysis. The second is the movement of drawing mimetic connections between the field and the force of the drama. And three, the recognition that James was addressing his own intention and purpose of number one, where they meet in this final insight. Its brilliance can only be wondered at. And for me, on occasion, grasping a clear-sighted glimpse of its possibilities. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.